Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're getting into something totally fascinating, a forensic, objective breakdown of a highly charged piece of political commentary. We're looking at a recent monologue from Sky News Australia that attempts a really complex rhetorical defense of a controversial political figure, while simultaneously launching a massive counteroffensive against government policy. It's like a giant puzzle, so let's take it apart and see exactly how this argument is built. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the accusation against Hanson. Then, we'll parse the actual transcript, analyze the handling of unforced errors, unpack the core ideological pivot, and finally, look at the polling and political fallout. Let's get started. Part 1. The accusation against Hanson. To really wrap our heads around this defense strategy, we first have to understand the primary controversy that actually triggered this whole monologue.
So, according to the source material, a huge, coordinated wave of criticism just crashed down on Pauline Hanson over a 72-hour period. And the list of critics? It is extensive. We're talking major media and political entities: The Guardian, the ABC, SBS, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Labour Party, and even the deputy federal leader of the Liberals. The commentator frames this as a unified establishment front that they are absolutely ready to push back against.
And what exactly was the core accusation that united all these different critics? It boils down perfectly to this summary quote from the source. Hanson had, as a matter of fact, lamented the end of the White Australia policy. The commentator points out that these groups universally claim she wanted to bring back a race-based immigration policy after making some comments during a meeting in London. This specific accusation, that is the absolute foundation the commentator is trying to dismantle. Part 2. Parsing the actual transcript. Now here's where things get really interesting. The commentator builds their main defense by putting the media's allegations right up against Hanson's actual recorded words. And this brilliantly illustrates the crux of the defense. You see, critics implied she was mourning the end of White Australia and actively wanted it back. But the source counters with her exact quote, where she says, "It started in 1973 with Gough Whitlam, so they opened it up and got rid of the White Australia policy." The argument here is that she was literally just using the policy as a historical reference point, firmly denying any desire to return to it. To add some context to her remarks, the source gives us a historical framing of the policy itself. They start with Sir Robert Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party, who actually defended maintaining a homogeneous population at the time. Then, the source notes that it was early Liberal governments that started dismantling the policy, leading up to 1973 when Gough Whitlam's Labour government officially ended it. By bringing up this history, the speaker is arguing that referencing the policy is just stating a historical fact about mass migration, not advocating for a trip back in time.
To really lock in this defense, the source leans heavily on a very explicit on-the-record denial from Hanson herself. "Never ever have I advocated that, and I don't believe in it." The commentator uses this clear-cut statement as their anchor. They're saying, look, the mainstream media narrative is entirely false.
But they don't just stop with Hanson's word. The source bolsters this defense by presenting what they frame as a unified front of denials. The commentator cites corroborating public statements from her One Nation colleague Barnaby Joyce and her daughter Lee. Both of them firmly denied that she wished the policy was still around or that she wanted it reinstated.
Now, this takes a fascinating rhetorical turn. The source highlights a quote from Julian Hill, the Labour government's assistant minister for multiculturalism. Hill essentially argues that the mere fact a politician today even has to explicitly deny supporting the White Australia policy is a massive red flag. He asks, what has got you to that place? The source frames this as the Labour Party trying to say that just the act of having to issue a denial is essentially proof of underlying guilt. Well, the commentator fires back with a really aggressive rebuttal to Hill's logic. According to the source, what got them to that place isn't guilt at all. It's deliberate lies from political opponents. They frame the whole situation as a malicious political trap. Critics invent a smear, force the innocent party to speak up to defend themselves, and then use that very defense as proof that a problem exists. Part 3. Unforced errors and missteps. In rhetorical analysis, conceding a flaw can be a highly effective way to build credibility with an audience, and we see that exact tactic playing out right here. The commentator deliberately distances themselves from Hanson's choice of associates, specifically Tommy Robinson. And they do not hold back. The source characterizes him severely, calling him a far-right thug and a creep. They point out he's a convicted criminal who bashed a policeman, has been banned from Australia twice, and actively lied to Hanson. To drive this concession home, the source pulls a quote from Channel 7's Liam Bartlett during an interview with Hanson, where he says, "Honestly, Pauline, you're in a position now, do your research." The commentator uses this to shine a light on what they call her unforced errors and a lack of preparation. By keeping our clinical observation going, we could see the speaker is tactically sacrificing Hanson's competence in this one specific instance in order to preserve her overall ideological innocence regarding that main accusation.
Part 4. The core ideological pivot. So the crucial point is right here. This is the moment the source completely shifts gears, pivoting away from just defending Hanson and going straight on the offensive against their targets.
The commentator claims the media is lying about Hanson to distract from what they consider to be the real issue. And how do they define that issue? They claim national identity and national unity are rotting away because of mass immigration and multiculturalism. They even go as far as describing multiculturalism as a policy keeping people in cultural ghettos. Now, we definitely need to note here that this highly charged, controversial viewpoint is directly attributed entirely to the commentator. It sets the stage for their broader ideological argument.
Coming from this ideological standpoint, the source launches an attack on several specific multicultural projects championed by the Albanese government. We're talking about initiatives addressing Islamophobia in educational institutions, critical support for Muslim women's mental health, the establishment of a Muslim Affairs Institute, and grants meant to improve the understanding of Muslim history. The commentator actively criticizes these, framing them sarcastically as one-sided projects that just ignore historical wrongdoings.
This clash in worldviews is probably most stark when the source discusses Islamophobia. The government frames it as an irrational hatred of Islam, right? But the source attempts to completely reframe it as a well-founded fear of Islamist extremists. We are observing a direct collision of definitions here. The commentator is trying to take a term the government uses to describe prejudice and flip it into what the source claims is a rational security concern.
Part 5. Polling and political fallout. So how does the source measure the real-world impact of this fierce media controversy? Let's take a look. To prove their point, the speaker brings up recent news poll data, painting a fascinating picture of political momentum. According to the source, support for the accused, One Nation, is actually trending up, while support for the accusers, the Labour government, is falling. The commentator uses this data to argue that these massive media attacks are completely backfiring and actually boosting the popularity of the very people they're targeting.
And that brings us to the commentator's ultimate thesis, encapsulated perfectly in this striking quote. The more that Hanson haters lie, the more that they advertise that they are liars and that they are lying to hide their trashing of our country. The overarching argument here is that intense media criticism and hyperbole don't destroy these political figures. Instead, it empowers them by validating their narrative, the idea that the establishment is trying to silence them just to cover up broader societal issues. Which leaves us with a really compelling final thought. By dissecting this monologue, we've seen how a political defense is built, not just by denying claims, but by pivoting, attacking the accusers, and tapping into entirely different ideological grievances. It forces us to ask, does media exaggeration ultimately empower the very politicians it seeks to diminish? It's an absolutely vital question for anyone trying to understand the mechanics of modern political rhetoric and the wild feedback loops of our current media cycles. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this breakdown gave you some real insight into how these arguments are constructed.